This is London. Here live 215,100 millionaires, 516 semi-millionaires, and 45 billionaires. London is very, very rich. But the rest of Britain? Not nearly as much. In fact, citizens of what was once proudly called the United Kingdom now have less disposable income than people in America's 5 poorest states, and even less than the average OECD country. And if you remove London and the southeast of England from the national calculation, Britain's per capita GDP drops by 14%. In some parts of Blackpool, life expectancy is lower than in Rwanda. Entire towns and cities that were once prosperous are now among the poorest regions in Western Europe. Britain has fallen from the greatest empire on earth into decline. How did it get here? This is the UK, the divided kingdom. Our story begins in 1979. Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister. Her central goal during this campaign was to bring inflation under control. Because inflation had spiraled completely out of hand. $100 in 1970 was worth more than $300 by 1979. But what caused this? First, the 1970s were rocked by 2 major oil crises, when OPEC doubled and then tripled oil prices. Overnight, everything from gas to groceries became dramatically more expensive. At the same time, wages kept rising, as powerful trade unions demanded higher pay to keep up with soaring prices. This created a vicious cycle. Rising prices led to rising wages, which led to even higher prices. Loose fiscal and monetary policies poured more fuel on the fire, flooding the economy with money and setting the stage for disaster. Under the guidance of Chancellor Geoffrey Howe and hardline modernizers like Keith Joseph and Alan Walters, Thatcher declared inflation as public enemy number 1. To fight it, her strategy was simple. First, reduce the money supply. The Thatcher government deliberately slowed the growth of money, cutting the annual expansion of sterling M3 from 12% down to just 6% by 1984. Second, raise interest rates. In June 1979, they hiked rates from 12% to 14%. Then, in November, to 17%, the highest in British history. The logic was straightforward. Make borrowing expensive, slow down credit, and crush inflation. While this did help bring inflation down, the strong pound made British exports uncompetitive abroad, and the sky-high cost of borrowing crippled domestic businesses. Manufacturers couldn't invest, couldn't expand, and in many cases could barely keep their operations running. Third, cut government spending. The Thatcher government aimed to reduce the public sector borrowing requirement from 4.7% of GDP in 1979 to just 1.5% by 1983. And while the economy was already in recession, they did something unthinkable. They raised taxes. But Britain was already in deep trouble. Over 2 million people were unemployed, and every month another 100,000 joined the dole queues. It was so shocking that 364 economists signed a letter to the Times, stating that this policy had no basis in economic theory. So the question was, did it work? Yes, it did work. Though extreme, these measures brought inflation down from 13% in 1979 to just 5% by 1983. But at what cost? High interest rates, a strong pound, and spending cuts crushed Britain's manufacturing towns. The country's industrial base was devastated, and regional inequality began to take root. Meanwhile, London was living a completely different story, one based on a service economy. Unlike most of Britain, London managed to hold on. By the mid-1980s, unemployment in Northern England, Scotland, and Wales had surpassed 15%, while in London and the southeast, it remained below 10%. But why was this the case? Enter the Big Bang deregulation package. Thatcher dreamed of transforming London into a financial superpower. Through deregulation, fixed commissions and foreign exchange controls were abolished, the single capacity rule ended, foreign ownership was welcomed, and electronic trading was promoted. The result? International banks invested $450 million in the city. 1,500 new millionaires were created, and London cemented its position as the world's dominant financial hub. On paper, by the end of Thatcher's first term, Britain appeared to be experiencing a renaissance. GDP stood at nearly $1 trillion, but by the time she left office in 1990, it had grown to $1.4 trillion. Per capita GDP had risen from $1,500 in 1979 to $19,900 by 1990. Britain had become richer. But this data doesn't tell the whole story. During the same period, the Gini coefficient, the measure of inequality, rose from 25 to 35. That means while per capita GDP grew by 30%, inequality surged by 40%. So yes, Britain grew wealthier, but it also became far more unequal. Part of the reason lies in the devastating toll Thatcher's policies took on Britain's industrial structure. For example, in 1979, manufacturing accounted for nearly 30% of Britain's GDP. By 1990, that had collapsed to just 16%. And between 1979 and 1993, manufacturing employment fell by nearly 40%. So yes, GDP rose. Per capita GDP increased. But if you didn't live in London, that wasn't so obvious. The service sector expanded, but other industries shrank as Britain sought to restructure its economy from the ground up. Another way to understand the impact of this industrial shift is to examine the link between direct and indirect jobs. For instance, if you open a factory that sells vegetables, you might directly employ 100 people. But to produce those vegetables, you'll need steel, electricity, distributors, and many other supporting workers. So your factory could generate roughly 300 additional indirect jobs, giving a ratio of 3 indirect jobs for every 1 direct job. Now look at banking. For every 100 direct jobs, there are about 200 indirect ones, a 1.2 ratio. But in iron manufacturing, for every 100 direct jobs, there are over 900 indirect jobs, a staggering 1.9 ratio. In fact, if you look at the financial services industry as a whole, the ratio is about 1.3.6, which might seem decent until you compare it to other sectors like utilities, durable manufacturing, and non-durable manufacturing. Then it doesn't look so good. And that's precisely why service-based industries boost GDP more. But because income becomes concentrated in a small group, they also increase inequality. But this isn't just about job creation, it's also about wages and benefits. Manufacturing jobs were typically defined by formal employment contracts that included strong benefits, retirement plans, paid leave, health insurance, and sick days. Most low-skilled manufacturing workers had few alternatives that offered these protections. Studies therefore show that the decline of manufacturing contributed directly to rising inequality. And remember, Britain's industrial base was deeply regional. So while the South saw job and wage growth, historically industrial regions, now in decline, were hollowed out. Today, not a single region north of London has a per capita GDP above the UK average. Think about that. It means that, excluding London and the southeast, every part of Britain is poorer than the national average. Quick note, over 96% of you aren't subscribed yet, so if you're watching this a bit late, join the 4%. It's free, and it helps the channel. Back to the video. As cities grew poorer, people began moving toward wealthier urban centers in search of greener pastures. This is natural, and indeed this phenomenon is studied worldwide. So, as London boomed, many economists expected large-scale internal migration across the UK. But they were wrong. While Britons move between regions at higher rates than people in other G7 countries, London is the exception. In fact, more Britons move away from London than into it. London is the only city in the UK with a negative net internal migration rate. But how does that make sense? Especially when average household income in London is 14% higher than the UK average. Wouldn't moving there be obvious? Well, not if you account for housing costs. Once you factor in rent and mortgages, London's average household income is only 1% higher. So unless you're in the top income quartile, there's virtually no financial benefit to moving. Housing in London is nearly twice as expensive as the UK average. And when you consider what you actually get for your money, it's even worse. It's no surprise, then, that London has a massive homelessness problem, but one unlike anything else in the Western world. Homelessness advocates counted over 13,000 people sleeping in severe hardship in London in 2024, a 10% increase from last year and a 63% rise compared to a decade ago. Overall, 2% of Londoners are considered homeless. Compare that to New York's 0.8%, Toronto's 0.5%, Paris's 0.3%, Berlin's 0.3%, and Amsterdam's 0.2%. London is in a league of its own. One cause of the housing crisis is the right to buy scheme introduced by Margaret Thatcher in 1980. The idea was to privatize social housing by allowing council tenants to buy their homes at heavy discounts from the government. And those discounts were substantial. Initially, 33% off for houses and 50% for flats, later increased to 70%. Now, many conservatives might say this sounds like a good idea, but I assure you, it's not. The government was essentially letting people buy property far below market value, with no guarantee that the housing stock would remain affordable for future generations. This policy delivered economic benefits to one generation at the expense of the next. Moreover, local authorities were forced to offer mortgages with zero deposit. Do the math. If you bought a property with 0% down at a 70% discount, then sold it a few years later at market value, tax-free, you'd walk away laughing all the way to the bank. The problem was especially severe in London. In 1980, London had roughly 715,000 such homes, representing about 30% of the city's total housing stock. Today, only 390,000 remain. Social housing now accounts for just 10% of London's housing stock, a 61% decline. Furthermore, it's estimated that across Britain, at least 40% of right-to-buy homes are now rented out at market rates. But London's soaring housing prices aren't just due to this. Another key factor? There are no legal restrictions on foreign nationals buying property in London. This means millionaires and billionaires from overseas face zero barriers to purchasing real estate, and they've taken full advantage. In the first quarter of 2024, nearly 27% of all residential property sales in London went to foreign buyers. You might ask, what about other major cities like New York? While London sits at 27%, New York is at just 0.3%, a 90-fold difference. And it gets worse. Over 20% of newly built rental properties in London have at least one foreign shareholder, double the share since 2016. One reason for this is Britain's now abolished non-dom tax status, which allowed UK residents who claimed their permanent home was abroad to avoid paying British taxes on foreign income and capital gains. Some might argue this was a smart policy, but it reflects deeply short-sighted thinking. Yes, these individuals bring money from overseas and spend it locally, but they also compete with local residents for scarce resources like housing. A few such people wouldn't be a problem. But 83,000? That's a crisis. Countries around the world love the idea of rich foreigners spending money in their economies, but it always distorts housing markets. Sydney, Melbourne, Vancouver, all have suffered from this. What's more, these wealthy individuals don't contribute to the economy in the same way. They won't care for the sick or elderly. They're not opening local businesses or creating local jobs. Many don't work at all. They simply buy luxury homes and cars, dine out, and sleep. Yes, they inject some money into the economy, but they're mostly just inflating statistics at the expense of ordinary people. But housing is only one piece of the puzzle. The deeper issue is where Britain chooses to invest its money, and for decades, the answer has been simple: London. When most visitors come to London, they complain about the tube and poor infrastructure. Clearly, they've never visited other parts of the country. If you look at transport investment across Britain, London is far ahead. The city receives roughly $200 per person. Compare that to the northeast of England, which gets just $430 per person, or the East Midlands at $350. Even the southeast, the region closest to London, receives barely half what London does. To put this in perspective, if the north received the same per capita transport funding as London, it would get an extra $140 billion investment, enough to build 7 Elizabeth lines. Making matters worse, Britain spends less on transport than its peers. OECD data shows that between 1995 and 2020, the UK invested just 0.3% of GDP per year in roads, compared to Italy's 0.4%, Germany and the US at 0.5%, and France at over 0.6%. The tragedy is that this underinvestment makes Britain's cities less productive. With weak road and rail links, cities outside London have a much smaller effective labor pool. Fewer people can commute daily, fewer jobs are connected, and less growth is possible. One striking data point illustrates this. Britain is nearly the only place in Western Europe. Here, city size does not strongly correlate with economic productivity. Poor infrastructure is a key driver of this disconnect. And it's not just transport. The same neglect is visible in R&D spending. Research and development funding is heavily concentrated in high productivity, high income areas, namely London. In 2016, the government spent just $21 per person on R&D in Northern England, and $14 in AIN is an outlier. In Germany, poorer regions, those small bubbles on the graph, receive more public R&D support. In Britain, it's the opposite. The result is clear. The places that need support the most are getting the least. And Britain's R&D policy deepens inequality instead of reducing it. Now, one might argue that government R&D should follow private business investment, but Britain isn't even doing that. In fact, areas like London receive more government R&D support than their share of business R&D would justify, while the rest of the country gets less. In short, businesses outside London have been left behind, in favor of those in the capital. There's one final reason Britain revolves around London while quality of life deteriorates elsewhere. The United Kingdom is now a shell of its former self. Once a prosperous nation, it has become largely a relic, with only a single thriving city. Tony Blair once promised, "The kaleidoscope has been shaken, the pieces are in flux, soon they will settle again. Before they do, let us reorder the world around us." But 2 decades later, only one thing has been reordered: the United Kingdom itself around London. The tragedy is that elements of prosperity still exist in Britain, but until opportunities are spread beyond London, that promise remains broken. So yes, Britain still has money, still has power, and still has dignity. But it's all concentrated in a few square miles along the Thames. For everyone else, the empire has ended, the factories are gone, and the future is shrinking. London dines on Michelin-starred meals, while the rest of Britain scavenges like alley cats. Please like and share the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.